Subject: Ishmael and the epigenetic tool. Hello world and good day to you all. Welcome to the fourth promotional video for my upcoming book release titled, The Magnificence of the Three. For this video, I am going to submit a biblical event for your review, with one of the most controversial promises made by God personally in the Ten Commandments. To explain the meaning of my claim that once Adam and Eve were created, the rest of biblical stories were records of God's design of the human brain and projected developments. I submit this video to demonstrate an example of the effect of the application of opposite attract emotions on the human brain, that children end up inheriting from parents. Remember what I said in last video, both God and science came to classify emotion as helpers. Science came to conclude that behind every behavior and decision is an emotion. I also claim that behind every emotion is desire, proposed by God as the mother of all emotions. These two scientific parables discussed below have to do with the long-term harmful effects of the application of negative emotions. God provided caution in both stories for us, and guess what? It turned out to be supported by our neurologists and psychologists. The first event is recorded in Genesis chapter 16 involving Abraham, his wife Sarah, and their servant Hagar. God told Abraham that he would be provided a son. But Sarah had other plans and told Abraham to have sex with their servant Hagar so she could have a kid since she was barren. Abraham did, and Hagar ended up pregnant with a son. Hagar, however, was not happy, and according to the scripture, Hagar despised Sarah during her whole pregnancy. It is reasonable to assume that behind Hagar's behavior during all her days of pregnancy were emotions such as anger and hate. It is reasonable to assume also that Hagar was undergoing the modern version of what our experts classify as stress and anxieties. Our experts also classify anger and hate as negative emotions. From neurological and psychological studies of pregnant women, it is affirmed that whatever emotion the mother expresses during pregnancy, these emotions are also passed to the fetuses. In that case, Hagar and Ishmael provided the first recorded example of this part of brain design and development on Earth. Ishmael inherited negative behavioral traits based on the negative emotions that were used by his mother to survive with. The long-term effect of stress and anxieties on Ishmael was revealed through part of the blessing the angel gave Hagar. In verse 12, Hagar was displaying the stress she was going through by running away from Sarah. The angel found Hagar and told her in verse 11 and 12 that she was pregnant with a son, told her that his name was going to be Ishmael, and also assured her that her descendants were going to be multiplied exceedingly. However, the angel also told her that her son Ishmael was going to be a wild man, and his hand should be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Some have insinuated that God favored Abraham's son Isaac with Sarah over Ishmael based on perception behind this part of the blessing. However, the blessings God gave Ishmael during God's conversation with Abraham contradicted this. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 20, God blessed Ishmael with multitudes as was granted to Abraham, then promised to make him into a great nation, and that 12 princes would come through his descendants. Isaac also ended up with equal blessings such as the 12 tribes. The only difference to me was that Isaac was God's plan, whereas Ishmael was Sarah's plan. The blessings contradict any claim that God favored Isaac over Ishmael. The blessings, however, gave me a clue that this was a parable. The similarity in blessings for both sons formed the basis of my conclusion that this biblical event was presented as a story about an element of neurological design of our brains. Through the blessing, the angel projected Ishmael's behavior while he was getting developed as a fetus. He was going to be a wild man with his hand against others and vice versa. And as our experts have discovered today, the mother's anxieties and stress during pregnancy are passed over to the fetus during development. This means that the anger, hate and stress that Hagar felt towards Sarah as shown by her behavior, was passed to her son. The angel then projected that her son, would grow up a wild man and his hand would be against others and vice versa. What the angel projected for Ishmael, however, has now been confirmed by our experts scientifically with pregnant mothers today. This is an example of a biblical story presented in parable, but with scientific background that needed to be discovered, and our experts did. Remember what God projected in the Garden of Eden with Eve and desire that is now confirmed by our experts, in that behind every behavior is an emotion. The story about Hagar and Ishmael revealed another element of brain design and development, since desire and Eve came together to plan the future of man in the Garden of Eden. Anger and hate were emotions behind Hagar's behavior while pregnant, and the angel projected the son's behavior with full confidence as if she or he was aware of the brain design. The angel had been proven correct by our experts, as the mother's stress and anxiety problems do pass to their babies. This was the first biblical story related to an element of biblical brain design and projection of neurological development with the use of emotions as helpers. The second biblical story was also a parable about parental behavior that came to support the story of Hagar and Ishmael. As I claim throughout book, God planted parables in support of others. These two stories provide such example. This second one was also a projection of brain design and was etched into the rock tablets of the 10 Commandments by the hand of God personally. The commandment involved was the second one. For those unfamiliar with this commandment, this was where God directly warned us about what He planned on doing to descendants of idol-worshipping fathers. God promised to punish up to 3 to 4 generations of descendants for the father's behavior. This was one of God's promises that never sat right with me, as well as with many others, especially atheists and God's detractors. They generally use this part of commandments to point out that our God has no mercy even for children, mean and cruel, and justifiably so from the commandment's face value. I mean, why punish innocent children for the parents' sins if you are a merciful and a forgiving God of justice? I am confident today, however, that this was a neurological parable, as our experts have provided the scientific evidence in support of claim. Its meaning can be explained scientifically, and as similar to Ishmael's story, was about an element of brain design. Again, as I claim throughout book, once Adam and Eve were created, the rest of biblical stories were about the design of the brain and tools required for its developments. These biblical tools, for example, were the Tree of Knowledge, Garden of Eden, Tree of Life, the 400-year enslavement, the 10 Commandments, the burnt sacrifices. The first and second most important commands, the second return of God in the flesh, the crucifixion, or the Great Commission of the New Testament, amongst others. These were tools that I came to identify under a scientific theory called the social brain hypothesis, as influences of biblical brain development and brain expansion. There is more detailed discussion of this theory and its biblical implications in book. For the second commandment, however, God's promise and intent to punish the innocent children for the sins of the father can now be explained by a new field in science called epigenetics. This field is new but related to the study of genetics, where the term DNA that is often thrown around today comes from. To simplify these fields for our purposes, the study of genetics focuses on how our genes and traits are passed from one generation to another genetically. For example, God designed our bodies with a scheme that enables us to pass our features forward. This is why some of us have same eye color, hair color, shapes of nose, ears or mouth like our parents, grandparents or other family members. This is where the word DNA comes from, as these features are passed through genetically with this DNA method. The study of epigenetics, however, based on my understanding of research from this field, came about as a result of discovering that some traits are passed forward, but for some reason, bypasses the normal method of using DNA. An example provided by our experts involved a study of a worm, and it went like this. This worm eats bacteria for food, but one of them is fatal to the worm when eaten. The worm cannot tell the difference between the good and bad bacteria, and therefore eats both. While observing one worm, it ate the deadly bacteria and then had babies and died. Researchers were surprised to find that when the worm's kids were born, they avoided the bacteria that their mother died from. They concluded that the mother somehow passed the information forward to the kids. The question today is still how. The weirdest thing about this worm was that 3 to 4 generations of her descendants avoided the deadly bacteria. This is one example of a coincidental scientific conclusion that inadvertently came to reveal and explain a biblical parable. Since it is not passed genetically, I came to call what the worm passed forward to her kids as a survival instinct or trait. Researchers are still trying to understand the process though. But the case of Ishmael and his mother can be of guidance. Emotions are invisible, but they manifested into Ishmael's behavior, providing evidence that emotions were developed and passed by the mother. It was the same thing with the worm mother as whatever was passed to descendants. It manifested into behavior that saved their lives. The study of epigenetics, however, was born, and the meaning of God's intention recorded in the second commandment came to light. The worm explained how a behavioral survival trait can be passed to the future. Our experts discovered how we pass survival information genetically forward, but the worm revealed something else. Survival instinctual trait was passed forward. This means that once the parent begins worshipping idols, the brain considers it as a survival trait and passes it forward. The same thing with developing fear of God. The brain was not designed to judge between right and wrong, but to pass the trait forward that had been applied for survival purposes. What the worm did, however, had far more implications under spiritual scrutiny. It is indicative that belief by faith of a God can be passed forward without leaving genetic tracks. This is why the search for God in the DNA had been unsuccessful so far. It is reasonable to assume that the worm came to recognize the useful trait through trial and error before it died, and passed it forward. The human being's brain was designed similarly, and this was what God made known in the second commandment and in the story about Hagar and Ishmael. God had no intention of punishing innocent children, but to warn mankind that whatever emotion and behavior a parent chooses to develop and strengthen in survival pursuit, that emotion and behavior shall be inherited for up to 3 to 4 generations. The apple does not fall far from the tree, as the classic saying goes. I did not say this in the book, but I should have, as I came to consider the Second Amendment as to have been designed as if in remembrance of Ishmael. He inherited a survival trait from his mother for no fault of his, and God remembered Ishmael's circumstances when he set the laws for neurological development of mankind. One element of brain design discussed much further in book was how God made it possible for man to adjust it, or in words of science, prune it to adjust for survival purposes. The process as explained in book involves emotions as consistent with their tasks as helpers. So Ishmael and his descendants were equipped with neurological tools to adjust survival with as well. This was part of neurological design since the Garden of Eden. This video is dedicated entirely to this commandment because of its implication in neurological developments, but had not been dealt properly yet by our experts. Its inclusion in the commandments and the warning emphasized in it means to me that this neurological design was very important to God, and therefore should be important to our survival. This nature of the brain design had been available for the public, but our experts, for one reason or another, failed to pass this along with some emphasis, considering its value and importance for our survival. God had no intention of punishing innocent children, but the child of an idol-worshipping parent will surely inherit the habits of the father, hence the warning. The brain was not designed to judge between right and wrong, but to develop and strengthen brain connections that are linked to the survival behavior most often used. This is the kind of information that, to me, should be taught to 12-year-olds as part of preparation for the future of mankind. I end this video by pointing out that what God warned about in the commandments and with Ishmael's epigenetic inheritance is now displayed by the Russians with the invasion of Ukraine. The parents and grandparents of Russians today held Eastern European countries by force for 40-some years. Violence and aggression traits, amongst others, were developed for survival purposes and were passed forward. We are watching what God warned about, and the Russians will repeat same behavior, as this is your modern version of an idol-worshipping society. So make sure to get a copy of book, as this subject is discussed much more extensively in there. It is scheduled for release on April 15, 2023. But this is all for now. In case you find value in this video and believes it as profitable for mankind, please like it, share it and subscribe to my TM3 Club YouTube channel to await similar promotional videos for book coming up. But before you leave, it is my testimony that you will be equipped with scientific facts provided by books showing that God of the Torah, Bible and Quran was also a scientist and the truth. Thank you for visiting and hope you enjoy the video. Take care and have a good day. Stay blessed, and with God's will, we shall meet again.